Earlier today, we had Cass Sunstein. It's fitting that we had him professor at Harvard Law School, and now we're moving over to the Harvard School for the Humanities, where the author we're about to present is a professor. And in addition to that role, Stephen Greenblatt is the general editor of the Norton Shakespeare Compendium and the Norton Anthology of English Literature. And if you're, let's say, a high school theater kid just getting into Shakespeare, he might be a large part of what does it, thanks to his landmark book, Will in the World. And if you're the Pulitzer Prize Committee, he's the richly deserving recipient of your annual award for his 2011 book, The Swerve. In those books and many others, Greenblatt has essentially created a history of the Western world's modernization, and he's done so by mapping its art and its stories. And in his latest book, which is titled The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve, he tackles the dawn of humanity, or rather, as he makes clear, a story of the dawn of humanity whose influence into many its truthfulness have somehow withstood millennia of scientific, cultural, artistic progress. And also, if you let me open up the flaps here, return it to its pure, untainted state. It's nice and beautiful inside, too, so good gift. Without any further ado, Stephen Greenblatt.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm grateful to Politics and Prose, which is obviously a spectacular and precious institution. And I'm grateful to you for somehow not going to Tom Hanks tonight. It was another Politics and Prose event, but coming here. I want to talk about Adam and Eve, which is probably the most important and influential imaginative creation in all of recorded history, or at least in all of recorded Western history. It was probably written down in the form that we know it in around the 6th century before the Common Era. There are two versions, as you may remember. If you remember your Bible, there's a version in chapter 1 and a version in chapters 2 and 3. We could talk a little bit about the difference between those versions. The chapters 2 and 3 part, which is the one that you probably will conjure up if you think of 8,000 New Yorker cartoons, is the story about the naked man and woman and the talking snake. Probably comes from much earlier, maybe written down as early as the 10th century before the Common Era, and almost certainly much older than that as an oral story. So it goes way, way, way back. And it professes to be, and has for millions of people over the last at least 3 millennia, been a crucial way to understand who we are. For me, it was a wonderful project because I love stories. I'm fascinated by the power of storytelling, and I wanted to understand why this particular story has had the absolutely astonishing long life that it had. Part of the answer is that in a tiny, tiny compass, only even generously 50 verses, a page and a half in your Bible, it professes to be the key, perhaps, to understanding ourselves, our fears and desires, our dreams of loss, our deepest sense of shame, our impulse to transgress, disobey. It says something about species dominance, why, at least it professes to explain the origin of the dominance of humans, the origin of humans themselves, of man and woman, to explain crucially about love and sex and reproductive desire and the necessity to labor and the pain of childbirth and the fact of male domination, and of women having anything to do with men after they are dominated. It talks about the origins of mortality. It even explains the fear of snakes. So it manages in a remarkably small compass to make astonishing claims, and has worked over a very long time to help orient large numbers of human beings to essential features of our existence. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the three great Western monotheisms, all committed themselves to this origin story and to its intimation, its intuition that all humanity began from the same couple, the same two humans. There were important differences, and some of them are explored in my book, among the three monotheisms, so they all trace the humans back to that first couple. As you probably get, Judaism and Islam, though the story originates in a Hebrew context, and though the Muslims also have it, the story in the Quran, for Jews and Muslims, this story, the Adam and Eve story, is not, how shall we say, the central identity story. The central story is the story of Abraham and Isaac for the Jews, and Abraham and Ishmael for the Muslims. And that's where a profound focus of attention in both religious faiths lies. It was Christianity, really, that embraced the story of Adam and Eve in a profound way and made that story central in a way that it's been in our culture. And it did it, and part of the fascination, I'm skipping over huge amounts about the origin of the story in Mesopotamia and so forth and so on. But for Christianity, the story was originally an object of contention, of argument. But Christians decided, for reasons I try to explain, and I'll say a little bit about now, Christians decided to embrace the story, partly, maybe principally, because St. Paul had said that Jesus was the new Adam. He said it in the Epistle of the Corinthians and also to Romans. And Christians decided that if Jesus is the new Adam, it behooved them to understand who the old Adam was and to dig deep into that figure. But it was hard to do. It is hard to do. It's hard to do partly because the story has all the marks of a fairy tale on it. It was mocked early on by skeptics within the faith community, but also by pagans. Talking snakes and magical trees don't automatically go with pious belief and doctrine. There were large disputes about the size and nature of the first humans. What did it mean to be made in God's image? How big were they? What special powers might they have had? And then there were deeper issues than though the story is unbelievably, how should we say, restrained about the amount of detail it gives about these creatures, first creatures. But there are also problems that I think quite early on emerged in the story. I won't rehearse much of the story for you, though it wouldn't take a long time to do. But the God, as you will remember, tells the humans who are vegetarians that they can eat of any of the trees in this wonderful garden, with a single exception. And if they violate that prohibition, they will die. But he doesn't explain what death is to them, at least in the biblical account, the terse verses of the Bible. And so early on, people began to wonder, how, if you were in a garden where there had been no death, could you possibly understand what the warning actually had to do with? And that was one issue that came up. And then a still more problematical issue quite early on was what we could call the paradox of the prohibition, which is that the one thing you can't do is to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but without knowing the difference between good and evil, how could you securely obey a prohibition? How could you know? And that's not a kind of pesty modern objection or problem with the story. That's a super ancient objection. So that in 1945, an Egyptian peasant looking for fertilizer dug up a jar that contained, to his enormous disappointment, not gold but some old books, and the so-called Nag Hammadi codices. And several of those books, which date from the 3rd century of the Common Era, but probably actually were written much even earlier than that, so roughly almost 2,000 years ago, were several texts about the Adam and Eve story that said that it was clear that the hero of the story was the woman, or possibly the snake, or both, but certainly not the god, because choosing knowledge over an inexplicable prohibition from a divinity must be a positive choice. Now, there was a reason why those were found under the sand of the desert, having been buried for 2,000 years. That was an argument that didn't win in that community. But the fact that it exists already, that the thought had occurred to people is part of the fascination of the story. And I would argue it's part of the reason that the story is so extraordinarily successful over such a long time. That is to say, we think that what we want, particularly in the stories that seize us over a long time, what we want is something like transparency, clarity, in order to reinforce piety, let's say. But actually, it's probably not true. That the stories that most matter to us over a long period of time are ones that have tremendously deep problems built into them, and have to be cleverly, not the kind of story I would write, not just problems, but deep problems, ones that lead to an account such as this, getting stuck in the throat, as it were, never fully swallowed, never fully spat up over a very long time. So huge numbers of people constantly trying to interpret it. Now, there's partly an institutional story, and I have a little bit of, maybe more than a little bit, about the institutional story involved in having to do with the church. But there's also just the enterprise of people telling the story over a long, long period of time. Repeating it. You hear it, part of the magic of the Adam and Eve stories, you hear it once. When you're 5 years old, you never forget it. You see the little pen and ink sketch in the New Yorker, you know immediately what it's referring to. It's eerily memorable. And that's also part of the thrill, really, of this strange imaginative achievement. But as I say, it wasn't without argument. There was already very early a Christian bishop named Marcion, born around 80 of the Common Era, but from a Gentile background, who said, scrap it. It's not ethically coherent. Marcion was someone who came from a world of after all, complex philosophical, ethical thought. He had read his Plato, and he thought the story and much of the Hebrew Bible was impossible to reconcile with a philosophically coherent account, a morally, ethically coherent account of the world. So he ran a campaign, basically, in the 2nd century of the Common Era to get rid of this whole, what he regarded as barbaric Hebrew inheritance. He lost. He was ruled a heretic. His followers were persecuted. And what happened instead, for at least more philosophically sensitive people in the Hebrew community, the Jewish community, as well as the Christian community, is that intellectuals did what intellectuals like to do, and they came up with very clever interpretations of the story as a kind of parable or allegory. In the Hebrew tradition, there was Philo, and in the Christian tradition, there was Origen. These are two great figures of this enterprise of trying to understand the story the way the subtle intellectuals try to understand Platonic myths, for example. So they said precisely, you don't laugh at this story. There's no reason to laugh at it any more than there's reason to laugh at your own Gentile myths. This story has deep, complex truths in it, but they have nothing to do with magical trees and talking snakes. They have to do with symbols of human fears and desires, of metaphysical principles in the universe, and so forth and so on. And that way of interpreting the story, having to do with body and soul, complex representation of body and soul, had and continues to have a very long life. It ran in the Hebrew tradition all the way through Jewish tradition, through figures like Maimonides and into the present. Some of you may know Joseph Soloveitchik or other contemporary philosophically oriented Hebrew writers. But in the Christian tradition, it ran into a major obstacle, and his name was Augustine. Augustine, the great North African theologian, bishop, is one of my central figures for a good reason, because he basically made the story of Adam and Eve what it became for a very, very, very long time. And he made it so not because he was a, how should we say, tub-thumping fundamentalist, but because he was a super sophisticated intellectual who decided to make a peculiar move for such a person who came from a world who understood very well how the game could be played allegorically. But he said, no, the story has to be understood literally. It took him his lifetime to reach this position, but he reached it passionately and argued it persuasively, and was a fantastically good institutional player as well. And he succeeded in establishing for Orthodox Christianity the idea that the story must be understood at many levels, but it has to be understood at the literal level as well, as literally true. And it was only as if we understand its literal truth that we can begin to unpack its deep meanings. And those deep meanings for Augustine had to do with things that he worried about his whole life. A catastrophic falling away from an original innocence, a deep inward sense of guilt, the dream of a lost world that once existed before transgression and before disgrace, and that would explain all kinds of things in our lives and in his life. And Augustine is at least in my book, the first great figure to whom we have access to one of the most remarkable features of the story of Adam and Eve, which is a feature of literature and the imagination more generally, but concentrated in its pure form here, which is that if it works because you have to bring yourself completely to the act of reading and understanding. You can't stand back. It's about you. It's about your great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents, I won't fill in the greats, and it's about you. It's a way of explaining who you are, and the only way to understand that is to bring yourself complete to the table. And that meant for Augustine, of course, to bring his head, super sophisticated intellectual that he was, to bring his heart or his spirit as a profound believer in the redemptive power of Christ, but also to bring his body, and particularly to bring the part of his body that gave him the most worry, the most trouble, namely his penis. And he felt he couldn't understand any of those pieces, head, heart, or penis, without burrowing into the story of Adam and Eve and understanding what it was like at the very beginning for humans. And he thought that would be the key to unpacking it all, centrally for Augustine, famously because he came up with a notion that isn't in the early rabbinical interpretations of the story, and is not in Islam either, much later, the notion of original sin. That is to say, that what happened in Eden at the beginning of time was a sinfulness, a guilt that we all inherit, and we inherit sexually. That our disposition to evil is a sexually transmitted disease, and that has, and we've inherited directly from the Garden of Eden. And that doctrine had absolutely crucial consequences for the whole spiritual life of our world. Tons of things to say about how this works, both in Augustine's own personal life, which is very poignant, centered on his mother, the formidable Santa Monica, after whom we get the freeway and the town in California, and also centered on his mistress and with whom he had a child, and on the torments of his life. But what Augustine bequeathed out of his extraordinary struggle with the story was a commitment, as I say, first and foremost, to the literal sense of the story. But it's tricky. It's tricky to embrace the story literally, and he meant it literally. That is to say, he bequeathed to the West a fantastic enterprise of trying to understand all the details. Did Adam name the fish? If so, how did they get to him? Were there fleas in paradise? In the late Middle Ages, there was a saying, Adam had 'em, to explain this, yes. Did the first humans digest their food? If so, did they excrete? Was there shit in paradise? If so, did it smell? Luther said no, didn't smell. Did the animals die? Were there corpses? And many, many questions that follow from people who were not afraid to ask everything because they were committed to asking everything about the story. What was the snake's motivation? Who was most to blame? Did the first humans have sex before their transgression? And a strange question, but one that occurred to people fairly early on. One of the punishments that God visits on the humans for their sinfulness is male domination. Men will dominate women. But it occurred to people early on to say, what does it mean that it's a punishment? Wasn't that the natural order of things? Weren't men always supposed to dominate women? And evidently the story didn't think so. And that troubled lots of people who struggled, men mostly, to explain how you could imagine a world in which men wouldn't be dominant. And likewise, the story goes on remarkably to say that not only will the man dominate the woman, but the woman will desire the man, as if that wouldn't come naturally, as if it also needed explanation as a punishment, a form of punishment as a result of transgression, and so forth. In the case of the Christian world, but not of the Muslim or Jewish world, there was an enormous effort also to represent the bodies of the first humans, because unlike the Jews and the Muslims, Christians didn't prohibit images of the body. So very, very early on, we get people struggling to represent the first humans in paradise, and indeed finding this precisely as the occasion to represent the naked human body in a Christian context. The Greeks and the Romans, obviously pagans, had no difficulty representing the naked body. But if you go, for example, in Rome now to the catacombs of San Marcellino e Paolo, which is in a mediocre neighborhood, but a fantastic catacomb, you will see the oldest, as far as I know, images of Adam and Eve. I have one image in my book on the walls of the catacomb. And you can see some of the complexity of those very early representations. It's, of course, a representation of the humans after the fall, covering themselves in shame. In shame precisely because they brought about into the world the very reason that you have to go in the catacomb in the first place, to bury the dead, because without them we wouldn't have died. And they're ashamed of that. And they're played off against the figures of redemption and resurrection, such as Jonah or Daniel in the lion's den in the catacomb. Most of the figures in the throughout the Middle Ages representing Adam and Eve represent them in states of shame. And then slowly, something begins to happen. What happens is that the body increasingly gets represented not only in disgrace, covering itself, but in states of innocence before the fall, or visibly, or at moments like the Van Eyck altarpiece, just as they're perhaps about to fall, or most famously, actually, Dürer's 1504 image, 1504 copperplate engraving of Adam and Eve, just a second before the catastrophe. So much so that in that famous image, which is important because it was circulated around Europe, so everyone could see what Adam and Eve looked like in their happy state. Adam, as he's reaching for the apple, is standing lightly with his left foot on the tail of a mouse. Mouse doesn't seem to mind. And there's a very large cat who is looking with considerable interest at the mouse, but nothing is happening. But we know that as soon as the apple is eaten, the mouse is toast. And that and many, many other ways, Dürer cunningly represents this instant just before we all become who we are and what we are. But it gave people like Dürer or Michelangelo in the Sistine ceiling, or Masaccio in the Church of the Carmine in Florence, gave Adam and Eve bodies in a way that Augustine had only dreamt that they someday might have, for most people, visible appearance of real bodies. And then in the 17th century, as the climax of this extraordinary 1,000-year effort to fulfill Augustine's dream of giving Adam and Eve the literal presence in the world that he thought that they needed, there was the greatest poem written ever in the English language, Milton's Paradise Lost, which was written, published in 1667, and then in a slightly expanded version in 1674. But what happened with those, and I'm going to come to a close now by revealing what the plot of my book is, which I probably shouldn't do, but I'll do it anyway. The plot of my book is that the success, which is the great triumph of basically of the Renaissance, using every bit of its technology, literary technology and artistic technology, to confer reality on Adam and Eve, which was the ancient theological dream, that success leads to unbearable pressure on the story until it begins to crumble and fall apart for at least substantial numbers of people. That is to say, the more real Adam and Eve become, the more in the 17th century it becomes difficult to figure out what to do about those Native Americans who are wandering around without apparent shame in the New World, or what to do about the moral problems that I began with before, or what the linguists are supposed to do with the problem of people who seem to speak without having had to learn to speak, and so forth and so on. The problems begin to pile up. And even in Milton, magnificently, the problems are there, because Milton cannot stand the idea that humans could simply be tricked into transgressing, tricked by the snake. They have to make, Milton believed in human agency, and he also believed in human freedom, so that he could not, he invents a fantastic account of Eve, the reason that Eve is by herself when the snake approaches her. This was a problem that had occurred, all these problems occurred to people over thousands of years, a lot of times. The rabbi said various speculations as to why the conversation was between Eve and the snake. In the Midrash Rabbah, there's a rabbi who says, well, they had probably made love in the afternoon, and the Adam was having a post-coital nap, or possibly if he wasn't napping, he was out looking around in Eden, and therefore Eve was alone. But Milton doesn't accept such explanations. Instead, he has the fantastic imagination of a paradisal marital argument, still in paradise, still unfallen, but a disagreement. And it has to do with Eve and Adam both noticing that they're falling behind in the gardening because they need help. Every day they wake up and there's more things growing. And they know that help is on the way. Eventually they'll have children, but not yet. So Eve suggests that they take a break from gardening together and go off separately. They'll get more work done. And Adam commends her for, in effect, coming up with the idea of the division of labor, but says that it's not necessary, that he enjoys the time that they're together, and then he makes the fatal mistake of saying, because he's been warned that there's also an enemy out there, Satan, and that it would be best for her to stay by his side. And she's offended by this. Why? What do you mean? Why should I? How are we happy? She says, and she says, I might as well just been a rib in your side, just remained a rib, if I can't go off. And Adam says, go, for thy stay not free, absents thee more. For thy stay not free, absents thee more. That actually rather deep perception about what it is to be in a relationship with someone, however much you want to cling to them. It's also true with parents and children. You have to allow them liberty. Eve says, with thy permission then, slightly wryly, I think. And she goes off, and of course the rest is history, our history. The history that I pursue in the book takes me eventually to Darwin, of course, who puts the final nail in the, at least from the scientific perspective, in the coffin, and takes me personally to Western Uganda, where I went. I write about going to observe chimpanzees in the wild, since it's as close as we think we can get to our own origin story. But I don't want to end with my vision of chimpanzees, or my observation of chimpanzees in Uganda. I'll read you a couple of pages just so you'll get a sense of how the book works, what it's about. The book is quite personal about a lot of the characters, not only because I enjoy telling such stories, but because, as I've said, everything depends on the key figures bringing their whole lives to the act of interpreting the story. And that actually also includes not just the key great figures in my book, but also all of ourselves. But here's just a brief glimpse of Milton. This is Milton after his life has really basically fallen apart. He went completely blind at the age of 44 in 1652. He had always thought he had a great poem in him. He thought when he was a teenager that he had an enormous poem inside him somewhere, but he had not written it. He had written some terrific poems. I'd be happy to write them, but not the great poem he thought he had in him. Instead, he had thrown himself into the English Revolution. He had been one of the key figures for the revolutionary regime, and had supported and written in favor of the execution of the king. All of that had fallen apart. The revolution had finally collapsed. The son of the executed king was now in power. Milton was on a list of people who should have been executed, and it was only through the intervention of important friends that he escaped. He thought he was going to be assassinated. He had not protected himself by hiding some money, so he had lost all the money he had accumulated. It was a total disaster. His daughters hated him. He actually had very bad digestion, so we could add in the Saturday Night Live routine, he had gas on top of everything else. I mean, total disaster in his life. And so that's the setting for this. Milton was reunited with his three daughters, aged 14, 12, and 8. The blind father needed help. Though he had lost much of his wealth, he was still a man of means, and servants continued to do many of the basic household tasks. But the able assistants that he had once had in his office as secretary, who fetched him books and read to him, they were gone. His life's blood was reading, and now thrown back on himself, he craved more than ever access to his precious books. When some loyal friends paid him visits, he would recruit them to read, and he hired a young Quaker who had some Latin to come daily to his house. But the young man was periodically arrested. It was illegal to be a Quaker, and his help in any case was not enough. Milton began to demand that the girls read to him, often in languages that they did not know. He taught them how to recognize and sound out the Greek, Hebrew, and other characters. But he who had so deeply concerned himself with the education of children did not bother to teach his own daughters how to understand what they were reading. When visitors to his house remarked on the strangeness of his daughters reading so many languages without comprehension, their father would remark jokingly that, quote, one tongue is enough for a woman, end quote. It was evidently regarded as a witty reply. In 1663, 5 years after the death of his second wife, Milton married again, this time to Elizabeth Minchell, Betty he called her, a yeoman's daughter 30 years younger than he. At this point, relations with his teenage daughters, in particular with his eldest daughter Mary, had almost completely broken down. When Mary was told of her father's approaching marriage, she replied that, quote, was no news to hear of his wedding, but if she could hear of his death, that would be something, end quote. The family all continued to live together under one roof for 6 years, but there's no sign that relations ever improved. His political hopes lay in ruins. His grinding labor and eloquent writing over more than 20 years were for nothing. His exultant enemies laughingly burned his books. Most of his wealth was gone. Many of his friends were dead or in hiding. His daughters, whom he had alternately neglected and bullied, hated him. He was unable to wield a pen, let alone read a book. Blindness and fear of assassins kept him cooped up. All was lost. And yet, his inner world had vastly, incalculably expanded. Each night, or in the early hours of the morning, if we can believe him, he had in this inner world of his a female visitor. Milton called his nightly visitor Urania. The name was pagan, the ancient muse of astronomy, but in Latin its literal meaning is heavenly one. And she was for Milton the mysterious force within him that was enabling him at long last to write the great epic poem that he had dreamt all his life that he was destined to write. His prior attempts to write such a work had gone nowhere. He was able to show friends some scattered verses, but nothing more. Shakespeare had died at 52, having already retired to Stratford and given up his active career as a professional writer. What could the ruined Milton, who turned 52 in the year that Charles II returned to England, expect to accomplish at this late stage in his life? Yet suddenly here it was, through the virtually miraculous assistance of a being he called his celestial patroness. I think we must take Milton's claim of celestial visitation, however strange it sounds, seriously. The muse would come to him, as he put it, unimplored. With her protection, he would descend into the underworld, he would soar into the heaven of heavens. Above all, as if he could still see, he would wander by shady grove or sunny hill, or along the sacred brook that bubbled up by the holy sites of Jerusalem. And he would emerge from these reveries filled with a peculiar music that he had never been able to sound, that had never before been sounded by anyone. He settled upon a routine. He would awaken at 4 in the morning, at 5 in winter, and lie in bed for half an hour, listening to someone read to him, preferably from the Hebrew Bible. Then for an hour or two, he'd sit quietly in contemplation. By 7, he was ready. An amanuensis would arrive, and Milton would begin to dictate the verses that he had composed in his head, that had come to him from on high, or welled up inside him. If the amanuensis was late, the blind poet would begin to complain, as if he were in pain from what he was forced to hold back. He would say, quote, I want to be milked. It would emerge from him in a rush. He would dictate as many as 40 lines of verbally dense, syntactically complex, unrhymed iambic pentameter verse. He would have the lines read back to him, and then, sitting in an easy chair with his legs swung over one of the arms, he would begin to adjust and cut and tighten, often reducing the 40 lines to 20. The whole morning was spent this way, and then it was over for the day. Fearing his belatedness and anxious to bring to fruition what he had finally begun, Milton felt keenly the pressure of time and must have been eager to press on. But he knew that he could not force more lines to come. He had to wait for another night, another unbidden visitation. After lunch, he paced in his small garden for 3 to 4 hours at a time, or if the weather would not permit him to be outdoors, he'd sit in a swing he had devised, pulling himself back and forth. In the evening, he played music, received a few visitors, listened to poetry. By 9 o'clock, he was in bed, courting sleep and the return of the muse. For long months, extending then into years, these returns continued as if by miracle. The mornings would bring forth more verses, more occasions to be milked. The task was to keep going, to dodge the assassin's knife that he feared was hanging over him, and more realistically, to avoid infection from the bubonic plague that periodically ravaged London's population. By the summer of 1665, he had a draft, over 10,000 lines, of a stupendous poem to show his young Quaker assistant. What had seemed impossible had actually happened. Published in 1667, and then again in revised form in 1674, Paradise Lost was the bid for poetic immortality that Milton had confessed dreaming about in his youthful letter to his best friend. He had actually succeeded in rivaling Homer and Virgil. He had ascended the peak that Shakespeare had climbed. He had written one of the world's greatest poems. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Love to have your questions.
Hi, Stephen. I'm going to ask, I can call you Stephen or a doctor.
You may.
Okay. A personal question. In reading Will in the World and reading The Swerve and reading this, I see something that you've been doing and your heart is in it, that you look at a human being, an artist, a writer, and looks to explain to the world what people have taken for granted. Where did you first come up, and all your books have that theme, I believe. Where did you first come up with this methodology?
I mean, you imply that there's a method in this madness, but I'm not sure it is a methodology. I do think that, look, this book comes closest to, in some ways, to, as I say at the beginning, to the heart of my personal life, and in the special sense of my childhood. That is to say, I had parents who, in different ways, were somewhat obsessive storytellers, and in my mother's case, intimate storytellers. So part of my my being in the world had to do with feeling that somehow it was in stories that I would find out who I was, who we all are. And in terms of your initial canny question about the explaining of what is already there, or what seems so simple, what's remarkable about the story of Adam and Eve is also what's remarkable about the stories parents tell the children, which is that they describe what's there.
Yes.
What it's like to have 10 fingers, to wake up in the morning, to have everything that is. If you're a parent who speaks to a child, which I assume, because by virtue of being in a bookstore we all are, that is how we've all, as it were, come into ourselves. And that's rather than a method, I think this is for me, what my personal origin for this is.
Yes, and because you mentioned it earlier, that you see the strength of an artist, a writer, a movie maker, a poet, is that they could explain to the reality, or whatever, how they do to the masses. Yes. And sometimes, as you pointed out in The Swerve and others, it can be a conflict, and these people can get into trouble for doing that.
Oh, huge trouble. And huge trouble often in this story. I mean, over this story, which seems so simple and so pious. But the truth of the matter is that there is no such thing as simple piety. There are plenty of people willing to beat you over the head to claim that it is, but anything, including what looks so transparent, turns out not to be transparent, but actually the object of alternative accounts of the universe, including, in a way, what I didn't talk about so much tonight, but I would be happy to do so. I mean, the strong current of almost unbearable misogyny that has come out of this story, but it's not the whole story of the story. So in any case, I think deeply that we put our lives together with the stories that we tell. We do it now. They're dangerous. They have consequences, but we can't do without them. And we precisely can't do without them not only as sophisticated readers, but as human beings in a huge world. So it's everyone is in this particular boat.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for a great and entertaining presentation. As you know, Elaine Pagels wrote a book called Adam, Eve, and the
A
Serpent.
wonderful book indeed.
And I'm curious, what influence that may have had on you and what your views are of her particular interpretation.
I think Elaine Pagels, in general, Elaine Pagels is one of the great scholars of Gnosticism, of the secret alternative theories, many of which actually came back into circulation precisely because of the digging up of the Nag Hammadi codices. So I think Elaine Pagels is great, and I began early on in this project by reading a lot of Elaine Pagels and thinking in some ways that was going to be the center of my project. But for reasons not unrelated to the question I was just asked, I moved away from it, not from disagreement. I wouldn't venture to disagree with Elaine Pagels, who's a profound expert on this subject, but the Gnostic arguments, interesting, fascinating as they are, began to seem less compelling to me than what looked like the main line, as it were, or the multiple main lines of the story. So I commend Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, or Hans Jonas, and lots of other people who write about this remarkable current of secret alternative interpretations of the story. But for me, finally, it was Augustine and Dürer and Milton who were my heroes and villains, as it were, in the story. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question about, in the scripture, it doesn't say that Eve tempted Adam, so I'm wondering where we get this idea of Eve as like a temptress.
It says she gave.
Yeah.
She gave,
but he took willingly.
She gave, he took. I don't think willingly is also said.
I guess
so,
I wonder where it arrived.
Yeah. So several different things to say. First of all, I said before there's a strong misogynistic current. It was a current into which flowed Greek and Roman misogyny, centered on the figure of Pandora from Hesiod, our very, very ancient story, in which it's because of a woman that all the miseries enter the world. So it was possible, even easy, it's not a strong current in the Midrash Rabbah. And misogyny is not a strong current in the Hebrew early rabbinical commentaries. There are some, but there's a range. As usual with the rabbinical material, 2 rabbis, 4 opinions. I mean so.
Yeah, I wondered if it was something that came later.
So it comes. I think. I don't want to finger the pagans for this. It comes from a Christian. The first very powerful currents come from a Christian world, but they're Christians, I think, who've been very much influenced by and are carrying here Hellenistic ideas from the Greek and Roman world. The Christians began as you know, the Christians began by welcoming women to the table, the communion table. Christians were actually unusual in this religious world of late antiquity in welcoming women, but relatively soon the positions hardened into, or rather split into a condemnation of Eve and the celebration of Mary, and they went together, the two things, so that they had a kind of logic, internal logic, that focused ferocious condemnation onto Eve, but also said that redemption would come not only from Jesus but from from Mary.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, thank you for your talk, and thanks for the hint about the plot, because I was wondering about the title. So it makes-
Yeah, that's what the title, you're absolutely right. That title was meant to be not a joke exactly, but a play on words.
I just wanted to go back to Augustine, one hero villain, because he does get pinned as the one with the original sin, put that interpretation on that story. And in your reading of if you had to go back and interpret what the original writer was thinking, what daylight do you see between that interpretation, whether the sin would be passed on? How different would that, it's hard for me to imagine what differences there would be. I'd love to have you speak on
Differences there were, maybe I know, could be, if we didn't have that notion, you mean, if it had never been formulated.
that. Yeah, is Augustine's notion so distinct from what the original author may have had in mind?
I
And
see
how
what you're saying.
so or
Yeah.
how not?
No, I mean, the original, of course, we have no idea what the original author or authors had in mind. What we do have is a variety of early interpretations, rabbinical and also some early Christian interpretations, none of which, all of which, of course, speculate in a variety of ways about the origins of human misery, but truly in a variety of ways. So that, for example, some of the early rabbinical commentators say that what looks like evil in the story or sin in the story is actually a good thing, because it's why we live in houses. It's why we wind up with the Torah. Why it encourages study. Or there's maybe more zanily, there's an early rabbi who was talking to a skeptic in the Midrash Rabbah, and the skeptic says, "So if Jews are so great, how come Adam wasn't circumcised?" And the rabbi says, well, everything doesn't get perfect right away. Now that means that the rabbi thought, oddly, that the story there is not a story about the transmission of original sin, but about something like progress in the unfolding of humanity. So that it would work something. I mean, who knows? But something like that. What I wanted them. Hours we could pass. I have many things to say about Augustine, but what I want to say is that in some sense there's something monstrous about Augustine's account, since it actually says that the infant in the cradle is already profoundly sinful, and if indeed if that infant dies without being baptized and absorbed in the Christian community, will burn in hell because of the sinfulness that comes. I mean, so it's difficult to embrace comfortably this theory, especially because there were alternative theories at the time that argued, no, human beings have choices, they're free, and so forth and so on. But Augustine's brilliance was to actually try to think, first of all, why are we the way we are? Not accidentally and through a succession of apparently oddly bad choices, but just apparently systematically over a long period of time, forever, horrible, generation after generation, and there must be some principle. And then he came up with, in effect, his equivalent of a genetic principle. There must be some transmission, he thought sexually, that would be producing this effect. It wasn't just that people have the wrong models in their lives. There's something wrong with them as a species, something wrong with us as a species. It's hard to argue against that, at least some days when I open the newspaper.
Hi, thanks. There's so much in your presentation there for a basis for questions. I don't know. I was going to ask something about Augustine, and you've said so many different things. Seems like the Anthony Scalia of his time and his insistence on literal interpretation and so forth. But I can't. I think the question that I can probably put together better than any other is a really narrow one about something you said right at the beginning of your comments about when you were talking about the fact that the Adam and Eve story speaks to so many different aspects of life and so forth. That one of the things you said that it speaks to and that comes down to us is in women's opinions of men once they realize that they're in a situation of they're being dominated by men. First of all, did you say anything like that? And it sort of sounds like it says something about a women's perspective on things, as though those who put the words down there were striving hard to bring a women's perspective, especially a perspective that says we're dominated in this world, and yet we have ideas about that. So is there something there that it is genuinely a women's perspective, or is it just...
I hesitate to say it's a woman's perspective necessarily, but it is there, and I did say it. So if I were clever enough, I would have it committed to memory. God says, and you shall be, you shall have pain in childbirth, and you shall be dominated by the man, and you shall desire him. So you shall be dominated, and from very early commentators on, they understood that this to mean you shall be dominated by the man, and you shall continue to, despite the domination, to desire him. That is to say, you won't turn away from the man. As if whoever wrote this thought that this was a problem that needed to be addressed. Right. So it's fascinating to me, utterly fascinating. In other words, there is a long tradition. Anything can be said about the story. But that's unquestionably there in the story.
Other than recognizing that issue, so to speak, the original writers didn't seem to add anything more to that, any resolution to that.
No, they don't. Not in that form, but what the original writers, whoever they are, I said at the very, very beginning, even before, that there are two different versions of the story, chapter 1 and chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 1 says God created the human in his image and likeness. Male and female created he them. And then there's a very long early body of commentary that says that the original human was a hermaphrodite, that there is the whole idea of a distinction between man and woman that way is not true. That's an interpretation of chapter 1. Chapter 2 and 3 has the rib and the different account of creation. So already, even there's a interesting ambiguity about the relationship between men and women.
Right. Well, thanks.
I'm taking a weekend seminar starting tomorrow on Lucretius at St. John's in Annapolis, to which you would be a welcome surprise guest if you were so inclined. So I've got Lucretius on the mind at the moment, which prompts my question. As you've written, Lucretius and presumably Epicurus write a fairly detailed speculation about so-called prehistoric man, but there's no personification and certainly no mention of Adam and Eve. Do you think neither was aware of the story?
I think it's quite unlikely that Epicurus was aware. I think it's possible that Lucretius was aware, but there's no evidence for it. It's not inconceivable because by 50 before the Common Era, which is around when we're talking about, there was lots of transmission of lots of things were coming from the east. There were Hebrews in Rome. It's entirely possible that Lucretius could have been curious about what those people thought. There was an interest in Rome and in Middle Eastern cults of various kinds, Mithra and so forth and so on. So it's possible. What fascinates me, and it's implicit in your question, I think, and one of the reasons that I, having written the Swerve, that I wanted to write this, is that there was already, as you know, a very fully developed account, more than 2,000, more like 2,500 years ago, that the world consists of atoms and emptiness and nothing else, that there's no intelligent design, that the species evolve over a very long period of time, come and go, that it's certainly not all species created at the same moment, that the gods are not interested in what we do, that whatever moral life we have is our own invention, the gods are off having pleasure somewhere else, if they exist at all, and so forth and so on. This is hugely developed in the ancient world, and then basically it stops. And this is why it stops. The story of Adam and Eve is the other, profoundly the other side of this ancient thesis about the nature of human life and all life.
And we can take this one final question over here.
Good.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the two creation stories, which you've mentioned a couple of times. One in which a woman is essentially derivative of man, just made from his rib, and the other, we were created in God's image, male and female. How did both of those stories end up in the canon, and were they thought to be written at different times?
Now they're thought. Now most biblical scholars think that they were written at different times, and most scholars think that the story in the first chapter was much later than the story written in chapters 2 and 3. In other words, the story of male and female created he them, no talk about separate creation and so forth, was a fairly late story, possibly 6th century or before the Common Era, but that the story about the garden and the trees and so forth was much, much older. So that's one thing. But second thing to say is that that's a theory that only was really in circulation in a how should we say, in a legal way, an unpunished way from the 19th century. There might have been people before then to whom it occurred, but they had better kept their mouth shut. So before then, for thousands of years, there were fantastic efforts to try to reconcile the two stories and see how they could go together. And I won't go into that, but there's an enormous history of that. And the third thing to say is that even in what looks, as you summarized it, the more misogynistic or problematical version of the story, you called it secondary, there's an alternative account, of course, of there are people fairly early on that say that creation happens on an upward scale, that the female is the final, man was created out of dirt, the female was created out of something much nobler than dirt, and clearly is the superior of the creatures. And then there's even, though there isn't evidence for that in the story, in the Hebrew story, there's a elaborate early rabbinical speculation. The story is that it says God saw that it wasn't good for the man to be alone. So first of all, people worried a little bit. What do you mean he saw that it was good? Didn't he realize that from the beginning? I mean, he had to rethink this whole thing? I mean, there's already a problem that way. But then there's rabbinical speculation. Then the verse goes on that all of the animals are brought to the man to name. So some rabbis thought that it was a euphemism, that it meant that the man had sex with all of the animals, and only after having sex with all the animals in the world, he decided, I can't stand it. This is not what I'm looking for. And only then, because it's only then in the Bible that the woman is created. And what's fantastically beautiful, I think, in the Bible is that there's a very brief but powerful poem in which, I mean, it's not visible as a poem in the translation, but it's a poem in Hebrew, in which Adam, the male, says, "This one, Zot," he repeats it, "this one." So bearing a kind of ecstatic witness to the fact that finally he has got the mate that he had longed for. That's not, how should we say, necessarily misogynistic at all. It's about love.
Again, thank you so much.